Hey everybody, Christopher Wing here, and I am back with the next installment of my story of my trip around the world to visit every Disney theme park on Earth in under 80 hours. And when I last left off, I was at Disney's Hollywood Studios, but as you can see, I've got my Project Team Animal Kingdom polo shirt on, which means it is time to move on to Animal Kingdom. Just briefly to talk about how I got from one park to the other again. Normally, I would have just gone out the front gates of the park, hopped a bus, gotten on the main road, drove over to Animal Kingdom. Unfortunately, I had that camera crew with me, and as nice as they were and as glad as I was to have them there documenting this part of my journey, this did present a little bit of a problem. So instead, we got into the van, rode over to Animal Kingdom, but went past the main entrance, around to the side behind where they're building Pandora, the world of Avatar, which, by the way, looks absolutely amazing. Of course, they swore me to secrecy. I can't tell you anything that I saw there. It was all kind of a blur as we were driving past it anyway, but it looks absolutely phenomenal. I really can't wait for it to open. But then we had to continue driving around and pass Harambe Market and a little bit further on. And at this point I realized there's no like tunnel that cuts through the middle of that park or service corridor or back road or anything. No, the only way around is to drive completely around the perimeter of the entire park. And this is a park, mind you, that is 5 times the size of the Magic Kingdom. So it was a very, very long drive, and I'm looking at my watch the entire time going, I have places to be, right? But I didn't want to be ungracious, and I'm glad to have the transportation and everything, but I'm like, we've literally taken the longest possible route that you could possibly take to get to Expedition Everest. I think it would have actually been faster for me to get out and walk, especially considering on those back area service roads, like the speed limit is like 5 miles an hour. So, needless to say, I'm just biting my nails the entire time as we're going past the animal sheds and conservation station and back behind Asia and Cali River Rapids and even circle around the back of Expedition Everest itself, all the way back to I think it's called the Wilderness Theater, where they show the Finding Nemo show. And that's where I finally got to pop out and get into the park and get over to Everest. So it took quite a long time just to even get there. I'll talk about the ride in a minute, but let's talk a little bit about the history of Animal Kingdom itself. So why does this park exist? Once again, it's the old rivalry with Universal. So basically, in 1993, Universal said, hey, we're going to double our capacity in Florida. We built the Universal Studios and Disney built their studios to compete with that. Universal Studios doing well enough, they said, hey, let's build a second theme park. We'll build Islands of Adventure. So they announced that in 1993. Not to be outdone, Disney came back and said, hey, Universal, you're building a new theme park. We're building a new theme park. And so they announced Disney's Animal Kingdom in 1995. Both parks started construction basically in 1995, and they opened within 1 year of each other. And just like with the studios, Disney's actually opened first in 1998, and then Islands of Adventure opened the next year in 1999. It's interesting to see again that Disney sort of started later and opened earlier, which means that when the park first opened, once again, there wasn't terribly much in it. There were a lot of parts that were kind of unfinished. The whole Asia section that exists today, which is basically half of the park, was not there at all. And in the Africa section, it was mostly the African safari. And they had a problem too when they opened the park with dealing with live animals and getting them to do what you want them to do. And they built all sorts of really cool, kind of secret, sophisticated ways to try to sort of prod the animals to be closer to the guests in a gentle, humane sort of way by encouraging them to like feed closer to where the vehicles would be and things like that. But there's always been this problem getting animals, real live animals, to cooperate, and so to kind of safeguard or hedge that bet a little bit, they originally incorporated some audio animatronic animals in the safari ride as well. So you'd see like real giraffes, and then you'd see an audio animatronic elephant. And they had this whole elaborate story about these poachers and Big Red Elephant and the Little Red kid elephant, and you'd see the poachers would shoot at each other, and jeeps would swerve around, and planes would land, and you'd see the robotic elephants at the end. And I think, well, while I actually kind of enjoyed this, it kind of detracted from the idea that this is like a park about nature and animals. I mean, if the elephants are fake, you know, you kind of come away feeling like, well, what about those hippos? What about that giraffe? You know, so I think they sort of, over time, realized that they needed to concentrate more on the animals and less on the showmanship. But then this created its own problem, which was that people had a perception of this park as kind of a half-day park and very basically not a lot to do except look at the animals. And so Disney tried to counter this by building some other rides, and they launched this absolutely, in my opinion, hilarious ad campaign where they made up a word. And the word they made up, as you can see on this park brochure from 2006, is Natazoo. And they had, you can go on, I encourage you to go on YouTube and just Google this word Natazoo, and you'll see this ad where it has all these people with this different kind of ethnicities around the park all welcoming you in and seemingly speaking in this foreign language and going Natazoo, Natazoo, Natazoo. And then of course, and they show, you know, the different rides and the dinosaur ride and the river rapids and all of the Mickey and Minnie in a parade and everything. And then at the end, they say, you know, Disney's Animal Kingdom is a lot of things, but there's one thing it's not. It's not a zoo. It's a long way to go for that joke. But in any event, they've always had this kind of difficulty. In fact, originally, the park was supposed to contain more mythical, non-real, not actual animals. If you look very closely at the original park logo, which I'm wearing here on this shirt, you will see that there's a sort of parade of animals, and right smack in the dead center of them all is a big giant dragon. And that's because originally there was supposed to be a themed land around mythical creatures, unicorns and dragons and all sorts of stuff. And there was supposed to be a dragon roller coaster and a unicorn ride. But time and money ran out, and so instead of building the Beastly Kingdom, they just kind of slapped in a temporary area there and filled it with some character meet and greet and called it Camp Mini Mickey. And they needed a show or something else to do over there. So they took some old parade floats from the Lion King parade in Disneyland and then threw them in a theater and said, hey, that's the Festival of the Lion King show. And like many things at Disney, that temporary, you know, space filler attraction, the Festival of the Lion King, became so popular that when it came time to bulldoze that whole area to make room for Pandora, the World of Avatar, they actually had to build a whole new Lion King show theater just to house that show that originally was supposed to be just kind of a temporary space filler. But in any event, you may be looking at this history of this Beastly Kingdom and thinking to yourself, a roller coaster with dragons and unicorns, that sounds vaguely familiar to me. And that's because basically over at Universal, they needed attractions like nobody's business, and they were kind of poaching talent and ideas from Disney at every possible turn. And so when they heard that Disney wasn't going to build this dragon roller coaster, they went to the company that was designing it and said, hey, got those dragon roller coaster plans? Bring them on over. And so that's how Dueling Dragons ended up at Islands of Adventure at Universal. And the unicorn ride eventually got rethemed as Flight of the Hippogriff, and the Dueling Dragons coaster got rethemed as Dragon Challenge when the whole area later turned into the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. So there you go. No good idea ever goes to die. It just gets rethemed into something else. So anyways, to talk a little bit more about Expedition Everest, it's a really great attraction, and it follows in a long string of Disney mountain-themed roller coasters, starting with the original Matterhorn in 1959. If you're interested in these rides, there is an absolutely wonderful book by Jason Sorrell called The Disney Mountains Imagineering at its Peak, and it's filled with lots of really cool art, some of which I'll show you here. But I really recommend that you get this. First of all of his books are really fantastic, but this one is particularly interesting. So he doesn't say this in the book, and it's my personal theory, and maybe it's completely wrong, and it's just something I've made up. But basically, Disneyland had the Matterhorn in 1959. I've talked about it in previous videos. It was the world's first tubular steel track roller coaster. It was very groundbreaking and innovative. And I always got the feeling they wanted to build that in Florida. But, you know, Florida has a lot of rain and bad weather and lightning and other things. And the idea of building a partially outdoor roller coaster that would probably have to be shut down every so often as the torrential rains came didn't really play very well. So then they thought, well, let's just take the Matterhorn and put it indoors. And if we take the Matterhorn and we put it indoors, you know, there would be no light inside, so it would be in the dark. And that basically became Space Mountain. Space Mountain opened in 1975 in Florida. And if you ride Space Mountain in Florida, the track layout and the bobsled type cars and the double track and the way it goes up at the beginning, very, very, very reminiscent of the Matterhorn. It's not the exact same track layout, but it is very similar. Of course, the idea of putting a roller coaster in the dark was a novel enough idea that on the West Coast, we said, hey, we want a roller coaster in the dark. So 2 years later, in 1977, they built sort of a scaled down version with 2 side-by-side seating and some other improvements in it. And that became Space Mountain on the West Coast. In the meantime, more outdoor roller coasters followed. So Big Thunder Mountain opened in Disneyland in 1979. And they built it on the East Coast. It opened there a year later in 1980. And I think by that point they realized, oh, we could actually build an outdoor roller coaster in Florida and get it to work and not have people, you know, suffer through the weather while riding the roller coaster necessarily, or at least, you know, we've improved the structural elements of the roller coaster to be able to operate in inclement weather. So they kind of revised this idea of like, oh, well, maybe we should build a Matterhorn out here. And there's some really great concept art in Jason Sorrell's book that shows a proposed Swiss pavilion for Epcot. This concept art is from 1985. And it shows a little Swiss chalet, and lo and behold, there's the big Matterhorn in the background. Now, I don't know how they would have fit this into Epcot because, I mean, it just seems like it would be so out of scale with everything else in Epcot, but who knows? Maybe they could have made it work. In any event, they did not build the Swiss Pavilion in Epcot, but I think, again, they still always wanted to have the Matterhorn. And as I previously mentioned, the roller coaster that was supposed to go in Animal Kingdom ended up at Universal's Islands of Adventure instead, so they were kind of down a roller coaster there. And again, not a zoo. They really wanted to stress that there was more to do at Animal Kingdom than just look at animals. So a roller coaster would definitely help out there. Matterhorn doesn't really fit in with Africa and Asia, but hey, Asia has big mountains too, like Everest. So they went ahead and built Expedition Everest, which is basically the kind of modern day descendant of the Matterhorn in this very roundabout sort of way. It's a cool ride. It's a lot of fun. It does have its own technical challenges. So just like the Matterhorn has a abominable snowman that haunts it, the Expedition Everest ride has its own abominable snowman, a giant Yeti. Unfortunately, the giant Yeti, they got a little overambitious building this thing. Supposedly, this is the story that I've heard, it exerted so much force that it literally was sort of tearing the surrounding building structure out. Like it was just basically ripping the building apart because it was so huge and had so much momentum when it moved. So they basically had to shut it off, and instead now they just flash strobe lights when you go past it to give the illusion of movement, which a lot of people online jokingly refer to as the Disco Yeti, which I love. The other thing I love is recently I was at the Pacific Northwest Mouse Meet, and Bob Gurr, who has designed a lot of really big animatronics in his life, including the King Kong animatronic at Universal Studios in Hollywood. And basically they were asking him about the Yeti at Expedition Everest, and he kind of said, well, you know, let me in there with a hammer and a blowtorch and I bet I can get that sucker fixed for you. And I don't know if he could or not, but something tells me that Bob Gurr fixing that attraction would be nothing but a wonderful thing. So Bob, you've got my vote. Anyways, hopefully someday they will get it fixed. But in the meantime, after riding Expedition Everest, we paused for a few more photos before skipping back across the park, back over towards where Pete Safari is, where we got back in the van and headed over to Disney's Magic Kingdom, which is where we will pick up the story next time.